talk to you about why the field of neurodiversity coaching really needs the underpinnings of psychology. So Nancy's talk very much set the context for why we need coaching and why we need good coaching. I'm now going to talk about the things that should inform good coaching. But first of all, I want to say a huge, big thank you. My hangers on in the room are probably going to complain that I should have used a better photo, where they look more photogenic, but this is my part, at least, of my lovely, multi-technicolored family, without whom I could not be doing the work that I'm doing, because they are my greatest supporters. They are also my harshest critics. I believe one of them has already spotted the odd typo or two in our book. So really a huge big thank you to my family, to my husband, and yeah, you being here really means the world to me, so thank you.
Slightly bad. Cheers, husband. Walk on, sister. And my dad was here earlier, but he's gone upstairs to avoid COVID for a while. His partner is very vulnerable, so he's taking actually a massive risk in being here at all, and he's not here for me to say how much I appreciate it. And he's also critiqued my talk already. Yeah, absolutely. He disagreed with all of my metaphors. Sorry about that interruption.
My family also, because we've got a very neurodivergent family on both sides, we've pretty much got every condition that you could possibly think about. So in very many ways also my family have been a constant inspiration for writing this book. And I thought there would be no better thing than to actually hear directly from one of my inspirations. So just bear with me whilst I exit the slides and launch the next one. So, give it up for Jensen Maxwell.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to the book launch. I'm Jensen, I'm 10 and Almuth's nephew. I am one of the inspirations of the book about neurodiversity, and I'm dyslexic in neurodiversity and I'm on the waiting list for autism. And so, neurodiverse. Should I say a little bit about them?
Yeah, that would be really good. So, Jensen, I'll let you finish your name. Can you tell me a little bit more about dyslexia and how that affects you in your schoolwork, for example?
So dyslexia tends to affect me in my schoolwork, so I'm dyslexic mainly in English, and I just find it quite difficult with handwriting, spelling, punctuation, but my verbal ability and my vocabulary is where I excel in English. So how we deal with that is when it comes to a big main project in English, I tend to type it out on a computer, and it helps me with my spelling, my punctuation, and different ideas it has for vocabulary that I can use. And that really helps me because we're able to print it out and we're able to get what's in here and to make that.
When you're moving around the world, are there any times where you've noticed yourself, compared to other people, maybe getting a bit overwhelmed or things like that?
When somewhere where I tend to get overwhelmed is in very large public spaces, like, like really big crossings somewhere where you really have to stick close to your parents or someone to make sure you don't lose them, and there's like 100 people each time crossing, or somewhere where it would just be really loud, like a music concert.
Yeah. I understand. Okay, thank you so much for talking to us today, Jensen. What I would love for you to do next is to hand over to the next person who's going to be talking.
Round 2, fight with Almuth McDowell on stage.
Amazing. Thank you, Jensen.
Right, let me just stop that because it will just go into looping. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he wonderful? So that was unscripted, done by our resident film director, Louisa Maxwell, otherwise also known as Jensen's mum. For any Jensen fans in the room, we've got another 12 minutes of unedited footage available to you peruse in your own time. So, but I think what is really, really evident in this little clip, Jensen had his dyslexia assessment only recently. We had suspected for quite some time this might be one of the issues. He had a dyslexia assessment actually early last year, and the assessor went, no, you're not dyslexic. She was rather swayed by Jensen's vocabulary because he is incredibly articulate, as you might have realized, a very typical neurodivergent profile, totally happy doing a talk for people, got voted as a school counsellor, got voted as head of class. For both incidents, had prepared a written speech, of course, neurodivergent mind, left it at home, then ad-libbed it, right, and absolutely charmed everybody in the room, but will get overwhelmed when there's a big crossing and he really has to find mummy's hand. But just listen to how beautiful the assessment was that Jensen received at the time. He has really comprehended, right, there are some things that I'm really, really good at, like verbal comprehension is excellent, and he's super proud of that. But he's also twigged that there are things that he really needs strategies with, right? Comes back to the strategies that Nancy was talking about. So he needs to plan his essays first. Once he has planned them, he's got them in his head, then he can write them. Sitting there with a blank piece of paper simply doesn't work for him. And how beautiful is that a 10-year-old has now already learned these strategies that they can then use in their own life and refine as they go through the lifespan. And that's really what coaching is all about. It's about helping people to help themselves so that their lives become sustainable in their own way. So what I want to talk to you about is harnessing potential and expertise and taking you through a technique that I quite often use in coaching. I want to talk about psychological safety. I've already had some corridor conversations with some of you about how important it is to really feel that you're working somewhere where you can feel safe, that you belong, where people judge you for who you are and the contribution that you make rather than using any stereotypes that they've got in their head. And last but not least, work-life balance. It's a topic that is very close to my heart. That's where I started out my own research, but it is very, very different for neurodivergent minds. So I want to introduce you to some of the psychology. So, harnessing potential and expertise, and how to do that in coaching, why this is necessary. On average, neurodivergent minds tend to make better specialists than generalists. So those of you who know about neurodiversity, the way that you diagnose neurodiversity is by looking at people's cognitive profile. So somebody who is neurotypical, so the average person, all of their different scores will be within a typical range. So they would be as good as, let's say, working memory, as verbal comprehension, as numerical understanding, whereas somebody who is neurodivergent, what you will find, there is a really, really big difference. So people really excel at some things, but actually struggle much more with others. So my own cognitive profile is also spiky. My daughter sometimes say, well, your profile isn't just spiky, you can also be spiky. That's up to you to judge. So really, really right up there with verbal comprehension, anything to do with space, but actually processing speed is right down there, and so is my working memory. So neurodivergent minds tend to make better specialists. What our own research shows, that people are really good at innovation, creativity, kind of thinking outside the box, hyper-focus, so getting really, really engrossed in things where time and space disappear. But people often come to coaching with a history of having been marginalized or not having been understood for being different. So often self-esteem is rock bottom, right? You have had a message, particularly in education, that you're no good at things. Jensen is very, very fortunate to have had this really affirming assessment early on, but had he not had that, it probably would have been quite different for him. And also when you look at how you progress in organizations, please can I just rip up all generic competency-based systems, because what they usually means is that you have to be good at absolutely everything in order to progress, to get promoted. Neurodivergent minds tend to not do that because they will really, really excel at certain things and do less well at others. And what they are good at or not so good at really depends on their personal profile. The other thing is when people have expertise and they really know things very, very well, it's often not obvious to others that they've got those skills. One of the reasons for that is what we call automation in psychology. So when we learn new things, whether it's my eldest daughter at the moment is learning how to crochet. So when we learn how to crochet, we probably need a pattern. The younger generation uses YouTube, they no longer use patterns. So you need your video, you follow it, you need to think about what you're doing. But in time then that skill becomes automated, and the more automated the skill becomes, often the harder you then find it to verbalize what it is that you're doing, to then explain it to others. So that's a process that is called automation. And that is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to get to real expertise, because often people don't talk about these things, they don't verbalize them, but also there is this internal process where we know things very well, often counterintuitively, we find it harder to verbalize what it is that we are really good at. So a really useful way of unraveling that kind of expertise in coaching and getting people to talk out loud about their strength is a technique that is adapted really from naturalistic decision making. It's called applied cognitive task analysis, but it's really about unraveling expertise. So what you do is you use a certain set of questions and very gentle prompts, and you ask people questions such as, tell me about something which is part of your work where you know more than others. For instance, where others always come to you for help, which you think you do well. And then what we do together is we actually sketch that out. Again, that was a learning point for me not to use the word drawing, because some people think, oh, I'm not very good at drawing. So I've learned that sketching actually is a much more neutral word. And then we break that diagram down again and we ask certain questions. So a big picture question is the most important thing that you do in your work. They're like, what? Past and future. So this is often what people with neurodivergent minds will tell you when they look at a workflow, for instance. They can often spot where something isn't going quite right before anybody else has twigged that. So I remember a few years ago I was working with petrochemical engineers, and one of the engineers I was doing a cognitive task analysis with, he said that actually he always depicted his own workflows as chemical equations in his head. And when he noticed that something wasn't working quite right, it was as if the equation was suddenly broken. So we talked about actually, but how do you recognize that the equation is now broken and no longer works? Improvising, this is also something that experts tend to do rather well, but often it's subconscious where they don't know what they're doing. So when you notice how to adapt something in the moment, you do things differently. It's like, what? When you spot something that is different or amiss, it's like what? So that mistake spotting, that spotting of anomalies, again, is a really, really good question. And I've got a work example for you here. So some of you know that I've got a second life as a ballet fitness teacher. If any of you want to join me on a Thursday morning, you're very, very welcome to do that. So I tried to do my own task diagram to elicit how I think about my dance teaching, because I work together with some colleagues. We are all very, very different teachers. So my colleague Victoria, what she does is she actually designs and choreographs a class, and then she does exactly the same class for a month or so until she has perfected it and her students. I can't do that because I get really bored really, really quickly in doing the same thing. I see you nodding and over again. That to me is almost like torture. My friend Sophie, what she does is she does a very long combination on the right leg and then the same thing on the left leg. But in order to do that, you have to have really good working memory, which I don't, okay? So I do my teaching really differently. So the big picture is a clutch which flows and which everybody can follow and feels energized at the end. When I have that feeling at the end that everybody has got that lovely glow about them, okay? To me, that's a dance class job well done. The past and the future, for example, what I often do during a class, I do like an internal stock take where I use myself as a point of reference. How has that been for me? How does my body feel? Any muscles that we haven't stretched yet, moved yet? And then I will adapt and tweak the class in the moment, but also picking up signals in the room. Is there anybody in the class who can't follow? Is there anybody in the class who looks really bored, for whom maybe the class isn't challenging enough? Improvising, using my dance vocabulary as building blocks. So the way that you're taught in ballet is the sequences of steps, they've all got French names, and you use them over and over again, but in different combinations. So I've got this internal vocabulary that I can kind of then pull out and use as building blocks. If something is different or amiss, so adapting instructions. So usually when I teach dance, I teach it online, as one does know, because that all happened during COVID. So usually I would face the screen, but I actually noticed that for some students, it's much easier if I turn around. Then I demonstrate the dance steps. So when I notice that there are people in the class for whom that is easier, then I often say, actually, we'll repeat this again, but now I will put my back to you so that you can follow along more easily. Anything else? Anything is one thing that I have learned over the time, because I was taught in ballet school at a time when you got bullied, when you got screamed at a lot. You know, I remember one of my teachers, you always used to say, don't sit on your arms, otherwise you get fat. Genuinely, it was that kind of dismissive language. This is how I was brought up all those years ago. And it's something that I really almost consciously had to like park somewhere. And I always now make a genuine effort in each and every class that I teach to really always affirm the class for the energy, the commitment, but also the grace and the artistry that they've brought to every dance class. So there you go, that's my cognitive task analysis in action. And actually you could apply this to any work situation, but it's a really, really beautiful technique to getting to the really deeply held expertise and knowledge that somebody might hold in their head and also perhaps in their heart. Psychological safety at work and in coaching. Psychological safety, it's a concept that goes back to the work of Amy Edmondson, a US scholar who came up with the concept, gosh, it was at the end of the 1990s. Has been about since and had a lot of attention at the time, particularly looking at teams, whether or not people feel psychologically safe, and then kind of got parked and forgotten a bit for a while, but really is coming to the forefront again. So an environment that is psychologically safe, it's an environment where there's a lot of focus on relationships, on doing things together, but also where it's perfectly okay to make mistakes. And to say, actually, that didn't go very well. Fine, mistakes happen, right? That's life. Okay, let's learn from that and let's actually share that learning. It's also an environment where it's okay to be you, and where it's okay to celebrate and affirm difference. And anybody who's ever worked in an environment that is psychologically unsafe, it's not a very nice place to be. One of the reasons why this concept gained traction, again, Google did some research on the noughties, the Project Aristotle, and they really wanted to look at team function, so team diversity, team knowledge, and then they linked it to performance indicators in terms of productivity, efficiency, and so on. And the one thing that always made the biggest difference wasn't the diversity, wasn't the knowledge, no, it was psychological safety. It's really, really important for effective organizations. So to have more psychological safety is always better, because people will perform better, they will feel more well in themselves, they feel more engaged, more energized. It's a win-win situation. So how do you facilitate psychological safety? So here are some top tips, and they apply both to the workplace more generally. It's also really important to facilitate that in neurodiversity coaching, because people often come with that history of not having felt understood, not having felt celebrated for their difference. So having curiosity when people are very different to you, that's interesting, note it. Right? Ask curious questions, tell me more about that. Reflect back, I've noted about you something that is really interesting, tell me more about that. So that curiosity, that celebration. Also signposting that it's okay to ask for help when you need it. That's another big thing that came out of our neurodiversity in business research this year. One of the biggest struggles for people who are neurodivergent is they don't ask for help when they need it, because they've often got the message that, oh, you're kind of not worthy, or that it's a scary thing to do. So really signposting from the word go that it's okay to ask for help is a really, really important thing. And also role model. Admit your own mistakes or slips, right? Believe it or not, but none of us are perfect, and it's perfectly okay to talk about that and then to share learning, because that really then role models that it is an okay thing for you to do. So in time, one of the things that is really important in coaching is to use the coaching space as almost a role model for role modeling psychological safety, so that the coachees then become much more attuned to, oh, this is what a psychologically safe environment actually looks like, so that they can look out for that in their own workplaces. They can better support others, they can better support themselves, but they can also emancipate themselves and actually hold up their hand and say, do you know what, that wasn't an okay thing to do. Can we do that differently next time? So, work-life balance, last but not least. Work-life balance, actually, curiously, when I work with coaches, when I work with teams, I tend not to use that word, for the very reason that people often think there is an absolute standard, right? Like a gold standard that you have to achieve, and only then you have good work-life balance. The reality is everybody's work-life balance is totally different, because it's a subjective belief that your work and everything else that you're juggling in your life has got a fit that is good for you, where you feel happy and well and energized. And absolutely, it's not a static thing either. Sometimes, yeah, we kind of feel that we've got it, at other times it's far more elusive, and we have to struggle a bit more. The reality for many neurodivergent workers and coaches is that rarely do they have very regular work rhythms. So an ADHD, what they tend to do is they're hyper-focused, right? And they work really, really intensely for a period at a time. And then they back off again, and then they hyper-focus again, and then they back off again, which is often not what stakeholders in organizations expect, because they still think good performance is when you sit at your desk 9 to 5 and you do your job. By the way, did you know that today is the 100th anniversary that Henry Ford gave us the 8-hour day? So there you go, it's your key learning point. So Henry Ford has got a lot to answer for. because he really popularized the idea that actually for everybody it's a good thing to have those regular work rhythms, but actually the reality is for very, very many people it isn't. Having good work-life balance, and take this note home, is good for all of us because it's good for organizational efficiency, productivity. We have better relationships in and out of work. We feel more well within ourselves, both physically and mentally. So actually, working towards this rather than achieving is a win-win, both for individuals but also for organizations. The other thing about working with neurodivergent coaches is that burnout is very, very common, because you get hyper-focused, or people get really, really engrossed in tasks, and actually they no longer realize that they're over-tiring themselves, they haven't taken enough rest breaks. So that's something that also really comes into that coaching space, to help people to work and live much more sustainably and actually pick up some of those signs of potential burnout much earlier, so that they can take their foot off the gas pedal. Hybrid and flexible working. Of course, during the pandemic, hybrid and flexible working and remote working became the solution to all of our woes. A lot of organizations have embraced it a lot, because of course it also cuts down on the office overheads and so on and so forth. But guess what? It doesn't work for everybody, and hybrid working, really getting it right, requires incredibly good and thoughtful management. It's not very good, for instance, for many ADHDers who thrive on interactions in the office. It might not work for somebody with a mental health condition, because they never see anyone, they've never got a direct point of contact whom they could actually ask for help. So really, really important to get that right. So what we often do in coaching is to teach people about job crafting. Job crafting is a psychological concept where basically you mold your job into something that genuinely feels your own. So you shape tasks into something that really play to your strength. You work on better relationships, but you also learn how to think about things differently. So for instance, reframing a problem as a really, really good challenge that you could tackle. So job crafting is a really helpful way for people to work towards a work-life balance that fits them. The other thing is about negotiation. So people often think that, well, work-life balance, I kind of know how I do my best work, but they assume that other people also know that, and actually the reality is other people won't know unless you actually tell them and you have some active negotiation. And that might mean, for instance, negotiating how you work in a hybrid way when you come into the office. An NDer, for instance, might not find it so conducive to come into the office on a day when everybody else also comes into the office and it's really noisy and overwhelming. Yeah, remember little Jensen earlier, perfectly fine, to charm an entire audience when he's got a job to do, but actually to go into a really busy space where he doesn't know anybody, that is a really, really scary thing. So work-life balance, big topic in neurodiversity coaching, but again, I would argue really takes some knowledge and skill to also bring in the psychological understanding to help people how to job craft. Nancy, could I invite you to come back up onto the stage with me?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Almuth. Should we give her a little we'll do our conclusions because they're up there now and everyone can see them. And then I think maybe some people might have some questions for you. So what I think is interesting about all of the coaching models that we share in the book, and there's some chapters dedicated to some coaching styles and some coaching techniques like applied cognitive task analysis, like clean language, which is one of my favourites, things like transactional analysis, appreciative inquiry, lots of different coaching structures and techniques that you can use. But what they all share is an underlying philosophy of intrinsic human value, and that is something that kind of unites the book really. They all share the assumption that the more we discover about ourselves, the more transformation is possible. And that might be transformation as in reframing a problem as a challenge. That can feel like a transformation. It doesn't have to be that you suddenly become a different person. It can be that you change your mind about whether or not something is a problem or whether or not it's actually something that's part of who you are and can be used really, really positively. There's a massive assumption in my work of an egalitarian relationship between coach and coachee. A lot of the research that I was doing in my PhD, I was comparing one-to-one groups and group coaching. And I wanted to do that because in social justice settings like unemployment and criminal justice, we can only ever afford to do group coaching. And so people don't really get the one-to-one coaching to the same extent. And I wanted to make sure that those people weren't being ripped off, that they weren't getting a bum deal. And actually what happened is it turned out they were getting a better deal. And on all of the measures, they were doing better than the one-to-one coachees. And that's because I think it's easier to have that egalitarian standing when you're in a group. If you're one-to-one, there's just a natural expert novice. Now my coaches are awesome and they can unpick that. But it takes them a couple of sessions to unpick that expectation that coachees come in feeling like novices and they expect their coach to be an expert. And so they've wasted a bit of time. But when you go to a workshop and everyone's on the same place as you, it creates that egalitarian feel that you're not, that we're all just part of a learning process rather than, you know, I am the pupil and this is the teacher. And so given that, I don't think any technique is enough, and I really hope that the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts when you read the book is that rapport is the absolute baseline for anything that we do in coaching. Jackie's nodding at me, knows very well, does it all the time, very good at it actually. But yeah, the rapport, the alliance between the coach and the coachee is the most important active ingredient of the relationship. And so I really hope that in conclusion, what you'll take from reading the book and from our talks today is a kind of, you know, you have to go into that appreciating the beauty and the wondrousness and the magical poetic uniqueness of each individual person that you work with.
Thank you, Nancy. And in order to celebrate that absolute uniqueness, we do think that you need some specialist training, that you need to look to the good science of psychology that teaches you where stigma, where prejudice comes from, how well-being at work is facilitated, what it looks like when there is no psychological safety. Also appreciating that a bespoke approach is required, you know, like work-life balance, one of the examples, what my good fit work-life balance looks like will be very, very different to yours, and that's okay. And that's why coaching, whether it's on an individual basis or group coaching, is so powerful, because it's a technique to help people live more sustainable working lives.
I've just had a little thought actually about that balance of expert and novice. That's what we want our coachees to experience, is a sense of partnership and egalitarian, you know, we're on an equal footing here. But actually it takes a lot of expertise to get people to feel like that. People come to coaching expecting you to have all the answers. I mean, I used to often say to people, if this coaching were to be ideal for you, it would be like what? Which is a lovely clean question. And they would say, it would be like you're my fairy godmother and you're going to wave a magic wand and make it all better. So it's kind of paradoxical that in order to create an egalitarian power dynamic in a coaching session, you actually need an awful lot of expertise. And the more expertise you have at doing that, the easier it will be for your clients to get into that space of trusting themselves and knowing that they actually are the ones that have the answers to the problems that they face.
Thank you, Nancy. So, any questions at all?